What's up, everybody? You are listening to the Credentials Unscripted podcast. I'm your host, Matt Sterenberg, and we've got another phenomenal episode for you today. We're talking with Dr. Zachary Pardos, who is an associate professor of education at UC Berkeley, and we're talking about how AI and machine learning can help students navigate their transfer pathway. Very interesting topic. And really, the problem statement is clear, why we should explore a tool like this. And it's because 80% of community college students say, I want to go on and earn my bachelor's degree, but only 13% of them actually go ahead and do that 6 years later. So we have this huge group of people that want to transfer, get a bachelor's, don't end up doing it. Is it potentially because it's hard to navigate these transfer pathways? And then additionally, we have 43% of credits don't transfer. That number is actually a little bit deceiving. Those credits may actually transfer, but they don't contribute to my major or my pathway. So they're kind of lost credits, if you want to think about it like that. So we need better pathways, and we need ways to navigate those pathways. And Dr. Pardos really gives us an interesting explanation of the work that they're doing and why it could potentially be a game changer for helping students navigate and get on to the next educational opportunity. So without further ado, let's get to our conversation with Dr. Zachary Pardos. Here we go. All right, Dr. Zachary Pardos, welcome to the podcast. Zach, I'm glad you're here because I need a AI Sherpa, and I'm hoping you can be that person for me. But before we get into that conversation about how AI and machine learning can impact student pathways, tell us a little bit more about yourself and about your work.
Sure. So I'm a associate professor. I don't want to demote myself in the Berkeley School of Education. I also teach in the data science major at Berkeley and have a background in computer science, PhD. Have been studying, though, the application of AI to education since I was an undergrad. 2006, published first paper with a research supervisor on estimating student knowledge using machine learned models. And then 2015, got a couple of grants to apply AI to higher ed institutional data, and have gone down a transfer and articulation and pathway rabbit hole ever since.
So before we get into the work you're doing, which I think is fascinating, what is the problem statement? Why do we want to apply AI machine learning to articulation, student pathways? Like, what are we actually trying to solve for?
The statement I put on my homepage is economic mobility. There's a lot of things that inhibit economic mobility in America. One of the things that really greases the wheels of economic mobility is transfer. Articulation, but there's a lot there that has combinatoric challenges that make you ask the question, how do we even have any transfer pathways right now, given how difficult it is? And so at the core of that problem statement is, can recent technology, can AI plus policy, integrating AI into a socio-technical system, can that chisel away at the problem of economic mobility achieved through credit mobility in ways that we haven't been able to chisel at it before?
So when I was first learning about articulation, transfer, my first response was, don't we already have articulation agreements in place? And I think this is just kind of a funny intersection of policy, technology, and the pathways that students actually take, because we have articulation agreements in place already, right? I take this course at a 2-year. Here's what it will mean at a 4-year. Why is that not sufficient in our world today?
Yeah. So if you look at the California Community College, I'm from Berkeley, which is a member of the University of California, of which there are 9 campuses. It's a multi-segmental system, meaning in our case, it's 3 separate systems that are kind of sewn together by a combination of collaboration and legislation. There's 116 community college strong system and 26 California State Universities. 23, excuse me. And if you were to try to articulate between all the California community colleges and let's say a new UC that joins, given the average number of courses and departments your average community college campus has and the average that a UC has, you would be looking at 36 million comparisons. And that's just adding one. And so, and that's adding one, and that's also assuming you're only looking to articulate between conventionally equivalent departments, right? I'm only looking to articulate from your math department to my math department, when in fact, it's reasonable to look outside of the same department. For example, public policy departments sometimes have very respectable statistics courses that could very well be 70% or greater substitutes in terms of the material for ascending schools statistics course in the statistics department. So that kind of combinatorics leads you then to say, well, what's the number if we're articulating to all UCs, or what about private schools or out of state schools, out of state systems? And now you're talking about a number where, there may be more atoms and less atoms in the universe than the number of combinations of articulations to consider. And so, higher education doesn't have that kind of money to comprehensively do that sort of articulation. And as a result, articulation tends to be where we focus our attention on, right? Either there's legislation that has some money to do this particular program articulation in this major, this area, or the focus is on common feeder schools that are local. So you kind of get a bit of a bias of articulating more thoroughly to schools in the region of a receiving institution. So we do have program articulations, but we don't have comprehensive program articulation.
And doesn't it require like a translation? You could plop down articulation agreements in front of students. What does it mean to me as a student? Like, how does this actually color what I'm going to take? And all the research suggests that academic advising, some version of it, is really beneficial, but it's just hard to scale, right? So I think it's always funny when institutions are like, we have these kind of policies in place or these agreements in place, but how do we actually get it to be adopted and utilized? And what is the realistic application when you think about a student, especially a student who's maybe trying to work, right? Still figuring out if 4 years something that's realistic for them. What do I even want to do? And so that's what I think is really interesting about your work. And the analogy you used was, we have roads, but we don't have navigation, which I think is a really easy way to think about it, right? On Google Maps, I take a right-hand turn where I shouldn't have. It's going to reroute me, right? It's going to tell me how to get there once I take a different path. So tell me a little bit more about that analogy, the roads versus navigation, and the work that you're doing to help students kind of navigate their actual experience rather than just relying on these articulation agreements.
Yeah. Right. It's the difference between there being a PDF that describes your degree requirements and what an advisor does to kind of tailor that policy on a PDF document to your situation. And what we've been looking at is, how can you help advisors do their job? And then how can you directly speak to students to know how to navigate these pathways? Before I say that, I will say there's been a huge, initiative in higher ed called Guided Pathways. I want to acknowledge that program, or that kind of ethos that has been very well funded. And that really this is, I see a next generation guided pathways, where guided pathways certainly is a sensible approach to get better percentage of students finishing degree, in part because it hard codes your path, right? It kind of removes or reduces elective choice. But in doing so, you're able to plan exactly how many students should be in a particular course, right? You don't get surprise impacted courses as much. And as long as the student knows where they're headed to, you can say, you do this, as of this effective date, you'll get credit for all of that. But we know things don't always go as planned, particularly in this, stage of one's life. And when it comes to community colleges that serve a wide range of learners, that stage could be, deep into a career, or the part of life where someone's choosing to have children, or already has children, but is deciding to take on a second job, right? There's a lot of things that go on that can change that path, and Guided Pathways doesn't have a rerouting feature to it. It has, here's your route. And so modern GPS do have that. And so what needs to be done when it comes to rerouting in higher ed? And it's a lot, because there's a lot of detours in higher ed. There's a lot of closed roads. There's a lot of roads that are really bumpy, right? And you need kind of institutional knowledge to know that's a bumpy road. You may not want to go down that, even though it looks like it's a shorter distance. So how do we kind of synthesize all of this? And I think an advisor is a great tool, a great resource, a great person, a connection to have to do that. The problem, as you alluded to, is that you don't have a one-to-one, advisor-advisee ratio as the norm. Berkeley is quite lucky to have something more like a 1 to 30, 1 to 40 ratio, which is like about as good as you get. But the average is more like 1 to 1,000 at most colleges. And so if it's 1 to 1,000, you have 1,000 students to personalize advice to, it's going to be hard, if not impossible, to do a really deep personalization with all of those people and all of the different careers they're considering, and therefore different receiving schools they're thinking about going to, and what courses to take given all of these objectives and constraints, like I have a job that ends at 2 p.m. So it's one of the most constrained choices maybe in one's life, is what courses to take next semester. And so part of the research has been, how do we, step A, create the pathways? So use AI to create credit pathways between institutions, which are otherwise known as articulations, but then how to then help students traverse those pathways, right? That's the driving part. The credit the roads are the paths whereby credit can travel, but then the student is steering that credit travel, but they need to know where to steer and which roads to go down that might not seem on the surface level to be efficient, but they historically are. So those technologies have been part of the research, is these kind of rerouting technologies. What kind of data do we need? It's often degree satisfaction data, of course, is part of the picture. So there's a practical problem to solve. That's not really an AI problem. It's what format do different institutions store their degree requirements in? How do we ingest that format? How do we ingest that in a format where we're losing as little data as possible? And so through several grants, we've been able to iterate on that ingestion process, get feedback from advisors, and every iteration requires less and less feedback from advisors. So we're doing pretty good on our first major to try this navigation tool on was a transfer for the criminology major in the State University of New York. And now, since we have that working pretty well, we're now going to see, well, how well did our ingestion optimization, how well will that apply to a new major, not a newly introduced major, but new to our system? Are we going to have to go through that same amount of work to tune for a new major, or like we expect, is there going to be diminishing amounts of fine tuning that are required? That's the prospect for scaling, is every time you implement a kind of AI assistive approach, you need less and less manual labor to refine it on the researcher or kind of technician end.
So you talked about how do we roll this out? How do we scale it? What are the actual inputs that you need when you're doing this work? How are you actually getting the data? How is it helping you navigate the history of what students have done to get a good idea of what students should do in the future? What are the inputs and the considerations that you're having to make?
Yeah. So for the path creation, we need the course catalog descriptions and any existing articulations within the system. So currently our partnerships, research partnerships, are with at the system level. So the systems give us all the course catalog information of campuses, as well as the existing articulations between them. And then we use a variety of machine learning, mostly borrowed from natural language processing and some of the latest work on machine translation, to then learn what articulations might be missing. For the path traversal navigation piece, we need the degree data, as I mentioned, any other kind of structured data that might be on hand, like prerequisites of courses. Obviously, Gen Ed is an important degree requirement that we need a description of. And then for the personalization part, so there's the requirement satisfaction part, which needs those data. And then there's the history of a particular student that a campus wants a plan generated for. So what courses have they taken so far? So we don't tell them to take another course that satisfies the same requirement that was unnecessary. We also want to know what institution and major they are wanting to transfer to. Some cases it's not about transfer, and we have at Berkeley deployed a experimental system that routes a student to degree just within Berkeley with no transfer consideration. But the input to this transfer plan generation is there a destination school you have in mind? What's the major there? And then we need to have the degree requirements of that destination. And then finally, in order to personalize to what looks to be a pattern in the kind of courses a student is taking, we need the course enrollment histories at the sending and receiving school for that, to maximize personalization. What we've recognized is those data are pretty hard to come by, and institutions need a lot more paperwork to be signed in order to get at that. So we've devised a way where plans can be generated without the whole student enrollment history for the last 5 years, which is what we've been using in our research papers. It could just be for the students who are wanting to transfer. And the personalization can come by them stating the kinds of courses that they would like to be taking, if they have a particular preference, like, oh, I'm into, computer science, but I'm interested in sustainability. So, wherever there's an option to take an elective that involves sustainability, or there's an option among degree satisfying courses, but one has more to do with sustainability, prioritize that.
So thinking about using the past enrollment history, is it for that specific student or students in general that have gone through a program?
Yeah, it's both. So in 2020, I think we have a paper at a conference called AAAI, which is a top 5 AI conference, 2021, excuse me, and it uses both the history of all students to come up with a normative model of a path, which isn't sufficient by itself. But
well, I was going to say, because how do you know that was, it's normative, but does that mean it's good?
Right.
Like, should we be replicating history is basically the question I'm trying to get at. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, and we've mostly been moving away from that. So in our pilots at SUNY, we're not using that normative model. I think you could get a benefit from that if you selected for it to only be trained on students who eventually went on to successfully transfer or graduate. Right.
Yeah.
Right. So yeah, definitely with you there. But then also the student can provide their data as in what courses they want to take in the future, as a personalization signal, because it could be that the courses they've taken so far weren't selected as a kind of expression of the personalized interests they have, and maybe even they want to go in a different direction. So one of the problems with recommender systems is if it's not possible to kind of perturb the recommendations you get, and you end up in this kind of filter bubble of all cat videos, being recommended to you. At least here, there's a feature where the student can express, no, I want to go in this direction. And so they don't have to have changed their history, or they don't have to take another course in order for the recommender to change paths or, to be modified. They can just sort of state that they want to go in a different direction.
So as we put on our futurist hats here and think about what this could look like in the future, do you think this is a tool that academic advisors use or institutions use? Or do you think this is something that is in the hands of students? Like, what do you think is maybe the closest? And then what do you think is most viable?
Yeah. Closest is administrators. All of our pilots in building a pilot system for interaction has been with articulation administrators. So it could be transfer staff, it could be advising, it could be the articulation officer at a campus. And we've surveyed them. We've looked at how they use the platform. We've looked at what kind of features in the platform lead to more adoption of recommendations, which lead to less. I won't get into those, but if people want to see the results of that, I have all my papers at zachpardos.com. We'll take you to my Berkeley homepage. And then faculty are next. But the problem of creating paths is so vast in the combinatorics. We need to leverage all stakeholders, and there's more students than anyone else. So they're not forgotten. I think they're a necessary part of the equation, so we can empower them to know what to petition for, right? If the system they're transferring into doesn't have these pathways, doesn't have, this kind of help, this technological support, or they just don't have enough resources to focus on this issue, often it's the students that have to say, well, but I think I should get credit for this. Here's why. Here's my syllabus. So I think a system like this could help them.
Isn't it, for a student to even have the wherewithal to advocate for themselves and to even know, like, the same thing is with healthcare, right? Your doctor says something, you're like, sounds good. You don't think to get a second opinion or to challenge it. And the same can be true for a student pathway where, like, I remember registering for classes. I remember thinking, should I be the one doing this? They hand you this thick course catalog, which I'm sure, it's all, there's better ways to consume that information now. But I remember thinking, so I'm going to try to get the classes that I want. And if I don't, what's next? And you had to get on a wait list, and sometimes you'd email the professor and be like, please let me into your class. Like, the idea that, students advocating for themselves it's kind of a shame that we are at that point in a way, if that makes sense.
That's the idea, I think, with the prioritization. They shouldn't be the ones burdened with this, but in the areas where the paths haven't been pioneered, at least give them some ammunition. That's probably the wrong word. Some justification, right, to back up their claim. Or if they say this is the destination school I want, tell them what they should think about asking for if they don't get it.
So one of the core challenges of this, I think, is, and the guided pathways is a phenomenal initiative, as you highlighted, but how it doesn't answer the question, how do I know what I want to do? Which I think is always one of those funny things when we talk about all this student pathways. Like, it's obvious it's good to have an idea where my destination is, right? We talked about the analogy earlier, which is we have roads. We don't have great navigation. This is all kind of depending on, I know where I want to go. Is there any way that I could think about the research that you're doing that helps me know where I want to go, right? Instead of just thinking about the pathway from here to there, can it help me navigate when I don't know what my destination is?
Right. Where even should there be? Yeah, that's a deep question. I'm not going to suppose that technology can be the only thing getting consulted in order to answer that very deep existential question. However, the closest thing related to it is we have been using ChatGPT in an experiment that we published to see how well it can recommend majors to students based on their personal interests, any career goals that they may have at the moment, and any favorite or least favorite courses they've taken thus far. So we collected that data from students at Berkeley who hadn't declared a major yet. And we didn't show them the ChatGPT recommendations because we weren't sure what the fidelity of that would be and the ethics of showing that to a real student yet. We instead showed that to real campus advisors and asked them to rate the quality of those recommendations. For half of the advisors, we randomly selected half to first ask them what their recommendation would be to the student of major. And then we showed the ChatGPT recommendations. And then for the other half, we did it the other way around to see if the ChatGPT major recommendations influenced their recommendation, right?
If they would agree with it.
They agree more.
Yeah.
Right. And the result was they did agree more if they saw the ChatGPT recommendation first, but it wasn't statistically significant. We had about 40 advisors in the study. The other finding was they scored the quality fairly highly, 4 out of 5. Mind you, it was advisors who self-selected into this experiment. So it might be people who are interested in technology, but it could have also been people who are waiting for an opportunity to criticize technology. We just don't know. It's a sample, self-selected sample. But we also found that, they expressed what's considered to be low AI aversion when integrating AI into a socio-technical system, particularly when it involves experts. The literature says you're going to run into people who dismiss the results of the AI or more quickly to do that than if the same suggestions came from a person. But here we're seeing some kind of warmth to it, and I think in part that's because the approach is to support advisors, right, in advising students, at least in this context. In other contexts, maybe you don't have the resources to have that be the setup, but the advisor can certainly be supervising how technology is used and making sure that the quality is there. And maybe that's a path forward, right? That integration of technology into education in a way that's retains the humane, nature of the educational enterprise.
I like how we just immediately went pretty much into like a Black Mirror episode with AI where we're like, can AI tell me what I should do with my life? And we're like, well, actually sort of, and it might actually be pretty close. And as we wrap up here, if I'm working at a community college or I'm advising students, like, give me the kind of the summary and why I should be excited about this moving forward. And if there's anything on the horizon that you want to highlight as interesting research that you're excited about, would love for you to highlight that as well.
Yeah, I think if you're a community college, something to get excited about is the technology. You have degree audits, or you probably have a degree audit system. That degree audit system doesn't give recommendations to students on what to take in order to satisfy the audit in kind of real time. But I think that's knocking at the door, that ability. What will slow that is the accessibility of degree requirements. You may have to rescribe, into another system, which is a pain, takes a lot of resources. But the ability to articulate. So if you're a community college and you're excited about, articulating to a receiving school's new data science program, know that tools are being introduced. We're working on it. I've Parchment, a lot of other entities are working on solutions. So I think that will be more feasible for them to do, is to articulate to those destination majors, and then that creates a bigger value proposition for students to start at your institution. And I would look for those tools now and increasingly in the next year. In terms of things I'm excited about, there are so many things to cover. We didn't even get to AI for credentialing, but I think that there's a real tangible possibility and utility to use AI to help determine if a student has earned a credential, right? It can be used in this kind of system I've described, to essentially do what a degree audit does, as well as recommend. So if it can do that, and it uses the kind of AI technology called neural networks that ChatGPT and really everything autonomous cars use, such that it has developed a kind of abstract representation of what it means to get a particular degree, what it means to take this calculus course at this institution. So with that kind of elemental understanding, which is still naive compared to a person, but can scale very nicely and may be sophisticated enough to equate to a degree audit system, can we then take that and say, well, what would it mean to get a credential in cybersecurity? What would it mean to get a credential in this, Cisco training or what have you? And I think those credentials can both be defined more quickly with AI, and more of a learner's prior lived experiences, courses, trainings, professional experience could be more seamlessly integrated and articulated to those credentials. So maybe they don't have to do, the whole coursework of the credential based on what they've done before. There could be a more fine-grained analysis of the skills they've learned in the past. My lab does some work on skill building and with an open source system called Open Adaptive Tutor. So potentially the combination of adaptive tutoring with pathway research could lead to a kind of more dynamic, streamlined system of credentialing.
Well, I think that's very exciting. And you just signed up for another episode in another season. But the idea that we are really focused on micro credentials, I don't mean Parchment, I mean the community at large. So it's all learning counts. How do we recognize what you know and how well you know it? And what you're saying is, the work that you're doing on the articulation front is very similar, right? Let's look at the history of the people who have gone through this program. What do they actually know? What does it actually look like? And then if someone can prove that they know those same things, then they should be credentialed. Whereas now we kind of live in this binary, you're degreed or not degreed. And even if you have a diploma, it doesn't really tell me a whole lot about you, whereas you could really have a holistic view of all the courses that I've taken, the pathway that I was on, get a lot more credentials, and just have a better idea of what like the learning outcomes actually are, rather than just a transcript that says I got a B in, Latin American history, whatever it may be.
Yeah, that's right. That's the vision. I will say there's not a lot of research that has been done connecting the kind of meso scale of course taking with the micro scale of mastery skills and learning objectives. So there is a bit of work and I think research ahead, but because those two pieces are, a lot of progress has been made on those two fronts. I think connecting of those two is one of those tasks, one of those projects and objectives that has now come into the category of it was too high risk before, probably to be funded. Now it's low enough risk to be viable with proper development.
Well, Dr. Zachary Pardos, thank you so much for joining me, and check out his work at zachpardos.com and pay attention to the things in this space. I really enjoyed our conversation and appreciate you joining me. So that is our episode with Dr. Zachary Pardos. I learned a lot. I think it can be intimidating when you're having conversations about AI and machine learning, but I really liked the way that he broke it down. And what really made sense to me is we have solid roads, right? We have these articulation agreements, but we actually don't have great navigation, right? How do we make this more actionable, more transparent for students? How can a student actually understand the route that they need to take? And when we have a diversion, right, a detour, how do we get back on track? And I think there's a lot of applications. And we didn't even get into AI and credentialing. And so if you're interested in all of his work, and I think that you will be, go to zachpardos.com to see all the work that they're doing. So if you're in higher ed and you're thinking about the impacts of AI and how it can help students navigate and get to their next educational professional opportunity, certainly check it out. But that's our episode. Like and subscribe. And if you have ideas or guests for another episode, you can email us at credentialsunscripted@gmail.com. Much appreciated, and we'll talk to you all real soon. Goodbye.